Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. This is another in my series of lectures for the classes that I'm teaching. This lecture is going to be for my corrections class, and what we're going to discuss is we're going to discuss Chapter 7, which is facility design to meet security and programming needs. So really what we're going to be talking about today is the actual brick and mortar institutions, how they're arranged, and maybe sort of discuss why they're arranged. And then we'll talk about programming within the jails or prisons. Slide number 4, get right into it. Prison construction has evolved with social, penal, meaning legal, managerial, and fiscal objectives. When we talk about fiscal objectives, we're talking money concerns. Social concerns is really in the forefront, especially with what's going on in New York. There is right now a concerted effort to close down New York City's jail system, which is Rikers Island. And in its wake, closing down Rikers, what would happen is that they would make 5 borough jails. So there would be a jail facility in Staten Island, Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Just one of the issues off the top of my head as to why we'd want to close Rikers is some of the conditions that the inmates and detainees have to live under. One of the issues that has been brought up, oddly enough, and it really depends on what your vantage point is that each of the cells and or dormitories don't really have windows, and if they have windows, they're very small windows, so that these new borough-wide jails would have bigger windows in them. The thinking is that what's going on is at Rikers Island, you're depriving the inmates of sunlight, and that this can affect mental health. So just one issue, whether you believe this or not, there are studies that show either side of the issue. That's up to you guys to look out for that. Fiscal objectives. Jails cost money. And the more money that they cost, well, someone has to pay for that. And who has to pay for that? Well, we have to pay for that as the taxpayer. There have been few changes in inmate housing units. No matter what, we're usually talking about a box design. Anywhere from it could have been 5 feet by 7 feet to what it is now, which is bigger than that. The innovations in corrections has come with health and security issues, advancing living standards for inmates, because even if you've been convicted, you still have some rights as afforded by the Constitution. So the first thing that this chapter talks about is the Bastille. We're on chapter 5, built in Paris, and it's a symbol today of tyranny and injustice. What would happen is the Bastille was a prison, and the French kings would imprison people that opposed their power. At first, this was nobility that would oppose their power. So if there was any sort of issue between a noble and the king, well, the king would rectify this issue by putting this noble in jail. As time progresses, more people get put into jail. So held nobles, political, and religious prisoners. I believe Voltaire was one of the prisoners. I'm not 100% sure on that, so don't quote me. But what would happen is if people spoke out against the government, well, you are now a political prisoner. It was attacked and captured by a mob that revolted against the King of France. In this case, we were talking about King Louis XVI, and was eventually destroyed in 1789, July 14, 1789, which is known as Bastille Day. It was a 4-story stone structure with 8 closed space towers connected by a 15-foot thick stone wall. And that was broken down, and it effectively started dismantling France's monarchy into changing it into a more parliamentary type government. Slide number 7, Pennsylvania prisons, the Eastern Penitentiary. It was sort of a rectangle with a round hub in the middle, and there were sort of like spokes like on a bicycle. So there were 8 cell blocks extending from the hub to that outer perimeter of the rectangle. Allowed each cell block to be observed, there were modern conveniences such as plumbing. So think about that being considered a modern convenience, having a toilet, having a flushable toilet, an operable flushable toilet. Slide number 9, the Auburn Sing Sing model. This is usually sort of the standard thing that you might see in movies, where it's sort of a telephone pole design, where two back-to-back rows of multi-tiered cells like this, arranged in a straight, linear, or straight line plan. So it's not curved at all. Cells were, listen to this, 3.5 feet by 7 feet long. Think about how much space that's afforded. Probably for most of you, your closets are about that big or close to that big. Compared to today's cells, which are 7 to 8 feet by 10 feet, which is almost sort of double the area. The outer walls did have windows. Doesn't state how big these windows were, how much sunlight was afforded each prisoner. Security checks by passing in front of each individual cell. This is very common throughout the United States. So this is why we're informed by Hollywood, because this is sort of the standard. The panopticon, probably one of my favorite words. When I think of the panopticon, usually what I'm thinking about is the way jails look in science fiction movies, how we sort of envision them in the future. So designed to allow security personnel to clearly observe all inmates without the inmates being able to tell whether they are the ones being watched. So basically what you have is you sort of have this hub design in the middle where you have your security staff, and then you have this circular pattern where you have cells in each of the cells. Officers on the cells face each other across a wide circular space with an enclosed observation point at the center of the structure. Think of that again as sort of the hub. Officers on the upper tiers must follow the curving circumferential balconies for some distance to reach the stairs. What this really means is that if it's on the bottom, it's easy for security staff to assist one another if there is an issue between an officer and an inmate. However, if you go to that secondary level, there are only a few staircases placed throughout that secondary level. So it could take the time to get up those stairs and go to wherever the officer who needs assistance is. And, the more seconds that take place, the more chances of someone getting hurt. Slide number 13, direct supervision. Cells organized on outsides of square space with shower facilities and recreation cells interspersed among the typical living quarters designed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 1971 after the prisoner uprising of Attica. Security staff on each level can walk around that level of the unit and see through the interior space to nearly any other of that space. What I'd like you guys to know is I want you to know the Pennsylvania, the Auburn, and the Panopticon. And please do me a favor, please do look at the PowerPoint, because what I tried to do is I tried to include YouTube clips for each of these models so you can get sort of a better understanding in conjunction with this lecture. So now we're on slide 14. Now this is sort of how prisons are classified. We have minimum, we have medium, and we have maximum. I haven't forgotten about Supermax yet, but usually this is what we're talking about. Minimum security, medium security, and maximum security. So let's talk about minimum security prison. Minimum security facility design. Open institutions are typically designed to provide labor rather than implement offender reform. And usually the offenders that are sentenced to a minimum security prison, they tend to be more low-level offenders. They tend to not be escape risks. They tend to be nonviolent, and they also tend to have not committed a nonviolent offense. Located in or near military bases, larger prisons, or other government institutions, inmates often work on community projects. because since they're not an escape risk, there's not as much of an issue to let them out to work, cleaning up highways, doing community gardens, things of that nature. These facilities typically have communal showers, toilets, and sinks. So even though you have a private cell, you'll probably have a private toilet. However, showering is communal. Eating, you're going to eat in a cafeteria, that's also going to be communal. Medium security facility designs. Dormitories that have bunk beds with lockers for inmates to store their possessions. I would say Rikers Island probably falls in sort of this medium security design. Communal showers, toilets, and sinks. Dormitories are locked at night with one or more security officers conducting routine patrols. The perimeter is double fenced and regularly patrolled by armed security. For those of you that have ever been on Rikers Island, you actually have to pass two checkpoints to get into Rikers Island, and then you have to take a bus to each and every one of the facilities. Holds nearly 1/3 of state inmates, and in these medium security prisons, there are recreational activities and programs. When we're talking about recreational activities, there are sports. So the inmates can play basketball. They can sometimes play baseball. Usually more, it's like wiffle ball. There'll be games in each of the dormitories. There will be TVs with cable provided in these dormitories. Now, usually when I talk about this, there is this issue. Well, why are my taxes paying for games? Why are my taxes paying for these people to get 3 hots and a cot and get to play basketball all day? Well, the issue is maybe you're right on that level, but what's the alternative? The alternative might be if we don't let inmates sort of expel this energy that's inside of them in a more proactive or pro-social way, well, then they're going to find more negative or anti-social ways to expel this energy. So stuff like this saves on staff security, saves on inmate security in between inmates, and things of that nature. Maximum security facility designs, corrugated double chain link fences, often with floodlights, electric shock features, and watchtowers with armed security. So there'll be towers manned by a correction officer with a firearm, usually a high powered rifle. And if someone is an escape risk and starts escaping, well, they will be ordered to stop what they're doing. If they choose to not stop what they're doing, well, there is a chance that they will get shot. Cameras, sensors, and electric deterrent fencing features are available. So we're talking electric fences. You touch the fence, you're going to get electrocuted with about 50,000 volts of electricity. That's enough to incapacitate a person for a good 15 to 30 seconds. Open visibility of razor wire, barbed wire makes it nearly impossible for inmates to approach the fence line without being detected. And if you try and get over that fence, maybe you figure out a way to disable the electric fence if that is an issue, if that's a thing. Well, you have to get over the razor wire, and that's a very difficult thing to navigate. Pods are basically jail cells. Within the pods, inmates usually have individual cells with ding doors controlled from a secure remote control station. For those of you that might have watched the show 60 Days In, that's a pod design. When out of the cells, prisoners remain in the communal cell block. So inmates are allowed to interact with each other. They're also allowed to interact with the corrections officers or security staff that are there at the time. Inmates may be housed in 1 or 2-person cells. Usually it's going to be 2-person cells on a bunk bed. Inmates may be allowed to leave their cells to complete work assignments, which we're going to talk about later in this chapter, or correctional programs. Now, when we're talking about correctional programs, think education. So if you didn't have a high school diploma, you can pursue your GED while you are an inmate. If you had your GED, well, you can pursue a college career. You can get a college degree, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, even a master's degree, or a Juris Doctorate, which would allow you to practice law. You would have to actually get out and take the bar. Uh, Actually, watch the video that I posted for Pods. It's actually pretty entertaining. It's about a guy that gets locked up and he talks about his experiences. I posted part three, which is the pod experience for him, but all three are pretty entertaining. He's a pretty good storyteller. Locations of many prisons. Now, here's an issue to think about. Everybody wants more prisons. The more prisons there are, the safer we are because we can get that bad element off the street. We can incapacitate them, retribution, we are deterring crimes. So everyone wants more prisons. The issue becomes we want more prisons, but we don't want them in our backyard. So where do we put them? So a lot of times what happens is they'll go to rural locations because these are less densely populated places as opposed to urban centers like New York City. So we have this idea of prison farms where there's this prison and then there's this big expanse of land. So even if we had an inmate that's an escape risk and manages to escape the prison or institution, well, they're still going to have a very far way to go to find a place to hide. So we tend to put them in remote areas, which adds a sense of public security, meaning we have the jails, we have the prisons, but they're not in our backyard. They're far away where they should be. Metropolitan areas, one of the advantages of having prisons or jails in the metropolitan area is access to services. So we're going to talk about, and we might have talked about this already, that there are medical services available in the jails. However, these are semi-minimal, maybe administering injections, prescribing prescriptions, things of that nature. But God forbid, let's say an inmate has a heart attack and surgery needs to be had on this inmate to, I don't know, maybe put a stent in one of his or her arteries. Well, that can't be done in a jail or prison institution. You would have to remove this person to an actual surgical hospital. Available space, there is more space to build the farther out you go. So in these rural areas where we're basically talking farmland and things like that, there's more area to actually build. Now, also, one of the things that goes part and parcel with this is that since there's not a lot of people there, there's not a lot of jobs. So when we build prisons, when we build jails in rural areas, one of the things that happens is we sort of bolster the economy because now there are more available jobs and more available decent paying jobs. The rise of the Supermax facility. So now I'm on slide number 20. Isolates inmates from the general population and from each other due to grievous crimes. So this is when we're talking about Supermax facilities, we're really talking about the worst of the worst. These are the most violent of offenders. These are escape risks. These are inmates that tend to be violent either with one another or with staff or both. In response to security threat groups, most states have at least one facility. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has several facilities. Usually in these Supermax facilities, inmates are really just allowed 1 hour of recreation. The rest of their time is spent in their cell or their pod. So we're talking about, now we can talk about the United States prison, the Marion prison was the protege of Alcatraz, designed to house the Bureau of Prisons' worst inmates, created a new security classification, level 6. So this is the highest of the high. This is the most violent of inmates. These are the most inmates that could escape. State of emergency and lockdown in 1983. The thing that I'd like to talk about is Brusino versus Carlson. This was a case challenging Marion as a constitutional area, meaning that the inmates were housed in their cells 23 hours a day. They alleged that this went against their Eighth Amendment and their 14th Amendment right, their Eighth Amendment right to cruel and unusual punishment, and their 14th Amendment right, which is that the state is enacting something which in of itself is unconstitutional. the judge ruled against the inmate, stating that this was constitutionally valid. So states utilize the Marion model. 36 states have built Supermax custody units with special housing units, again, for the worst of the worst of the worst, extended confinement units, and again, there's always going to be constitutional challenges and civil rights challenges. Admax, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, again, 400 extremely dangerous inmates. One of the issues here is we talk about we want more jails, we want to get the bad element out of society, but now we have to sort of ask ourselves, who pays for this? So the annual maintenance for inmates is $40,000 a year in Colorado. Now, $40,000 a year doesn't really tell the whole picture, because what we're talking about is $40,000 a year per inmate, but it's not really factoring in personnel services. So that number can easily triple. So the real number when we're considering personnel services, when I'm talking about personnel services, I'm talking about sworn corrections officers, I'm talking about staff that provide support services, the teachers, the nurses, the social workers, the therapists, things of that nature. So really have to start thinking these numbers as a total. So we're talking probably about 100,000, 120,000. I know in New York City for Rikers Island, I believe the number is 61,000 per prisoner per year in Rikers. But if you factor in personnel services, and I believe there is a New York Times article that traces this, it actually costs about $140,000, $150,000 per inmate per year. So the annual maintenance budget is $20 million per year at Admax. Offenders have no human contact, so it's basically 24 hours a day in their cells. If they're allowed anywhere, it's really to shower, and they shower by themselves. Reform is no longer a priority. Really, the priority here is incapacitation, deterrence, and retribution. I'm going to skip slide number 25. You can read that. I'm not going to really test on that. So I'm going to go to 27. The American Disability Act. Now, placing this sort of in context, there was a crime bill introduced in the 1990s. For those of you that are following the political race, you know that this is one of the issues that has been brought up. So with the crime bill, what was really sort of meant by this is that we wanted more proactive enforcing by police officers, and we wanted more proactive sort of process by the criminal justice system, by the courts, and by corrections. So we want to get that bad element off the street. We want to lock them up and throw away the key. Well, if you're arresting more and more people, eventually statistics is going to kick in, and eventually you're going to arrest a person that has some sort of a disability. So a growing number of inmates have some sort of physical ailment. The ADA 1990 ensures that correctional staff are trained on issues related to ADA and inmates. Compliance agencies must modify policy practices and procedures to accommodate inmates with disabilities. And agencies must conduct self-evaluations, evaluating how well they're dealing with those inmates on a year-to-year basis. I'm not going to do 29 because we already sort of talked about that. We've talked about 31. Let's talk 33. Internal security. Touchscreen surveillance systems in control rooms. As technology is advancing quicker and quicker, well, these technological advances also get applied in correctional facilities. So we're getting more and more video cameras. Video cameras, you can have a pinhole video camera now that captures really good video. We're talking 1080 HD video now. Prison staff has access to these controls in searching prisoners and movement control. One of the issues about internal security is, do we have enough staff to provide security? Is the design of the jail or prison in such a way to maximize the security of staff, whether corrections officers or support staff, and are there blind spots? Auxiliary services. I'm on slide number 36. Specialized facilities are essential. Staff must maintain security while supervising these auxiliary facilities. Now, when we're talking about auxiliary facilities, we're talking about kitchens, we're talking about laundries, we're talking about tool rooms, and sort of maybe sheds, or I'm not using the right word, places where things can be made. One of the things that most people think of, if you have a vehicle, you have a license plate. Well, who made that license plate? Well, a prisoner made that license plate. So there has to be staff that's in charge of watching these prisoners while the inmates are doing this work. Inventory of equipment and control of inmates. Here's an easy one. We're talking about kitchens. Well, in kitchens, you have food, but you also have utensils. Now, even if you have a plastic utensil, or maybe you have metal forks but plastic knives, can that fork be stolen and then manufactured into a homemade weapon? Absolutely can, and it's happened over and over again and continues to happen. Kitchen services and facilities. Now, usually when I talk to my students about this, I ask them, well, who would eat in one of these cafeterias? And I don't usually get too many hands raised. So, I mean, I sort of understand that maybe you're thinking, well, these are prisoners and you can't trust what they're doing with the food. But on the other side of that coin, think about this. If you are kitchen staff and you're working the kitchens, this is probably one of the more prized jobs that an inmate can get while they're doing their time. Do you think that they'd want to do something to mess this up? Because not only do they get paid, but they get to eat their food. And if they want seconds, no one is going to stop them from making seconds. So a lot of times the thing about this is a coveted job for an inmate in a prison. And if they get it, they're not going to want to mess that up. So service hundreds to thousands of individuals daily. So not only do inmates eat this food, a lot of staff eats this food. I worked on Rikers Island for about 2 years prior to getting onto the NYPD, and I ate the food every day. I brown bagged it for about a week, and then I'm like, why am I doing this? They're providing hot meals. So, I mean, was it the best? Was it a gourmet meal? Absolutely not. Was it terrible? Absolutely not. It was a decent meal. Was a decent meal. Usually, you had a protein, you had a vegetable, and you had a starch. Storing and monitoring cutlery. So this is something that the staff, that corrections officers have to monitor on a day-to-day basis, on an hour-to-hour basis, even on a minute-to-minute basis. These are always arranged in cafeterias. Staff training and monitoring equipment and food usage, meaning that if you are a corrections officer and you're in charge of the kitchen, well, you're going to have to know proper sanitation procedures for kitchens. Things have to be clean. Things have to pass Department of Health standards, no matter what jurisdiction we're talking about. Every jurisdiction has some sort of Department of Health mechanism that will sort of view the sanitation, the proper storing of food, the proper cooking of food, the proper disposal of food. Kitchen products have various security features, and again, I included a YouTube link, so check that one out. Other facilities, well, laundry. Uh, Inmates are provided clothing. You've probably seen the orange jumpsuits. Well, they don't just wear one orange jumpsuit for whatever their sentence is. They're going to be given, probably about 5 or 6 of them, and they have to go to the laundry and they get cleaned. So in order for things to get cleaned, we need reliable industrial strength washers and dryers and proper detergents to clean this stuff. Recreational facilities, these pro-social activities. So there could be things like exercise programs, definitely basketball. There are, I believe, Now in some in some jails and prisons, video games. So you can play your Xbox, you can play your PlayStation while you're doing your time. And, that sort of sounds counterintuitive to some people. However, would you rather them spend their time playing, let's say, Call of Duty on their PlayStation or hurting someone else, staff or inmate? Something to think about. Religious facilities. Now, this is something we haven't really talked about. Now, one of the constitutional amendments that applies to a person that's been convicted of an offense is the freedom to practice their religion peacefully. So there has to be religious facilities provided for a person to worship, meaning that there has to be some sort of chapel, some sort of mosque type situation. It's not going to be a full mosque, but a prayer area for Muslims, a prayer area for Jewish people, for Christians, Catholics, and Protestants. And also, part and parcel with this, getting back to the kitchen services, if you are a practicing Muslim and what you want to eat is halal meals, well, there have been many cases that have sided with the inmate that a halal meal has to be provided to a Muslim inmate. Also, a kosher meal has to be provided to a Jewish inmate. Tool shop facilities, productive though requires strict inventory, meaning that if we're talking about a tool shed, there are many things there that can be utilized as weapons: screwdrivers, files, hammers. So we have to account if there were three, let's say, hammers or mallets prior to the inmates going into the tool shop. Well, there better be three when they leave, because if not, there's definitely going to be an issue, and we don't want that kind of issue. Last slide, technology systems, innovations in alarms and cameras, and everyone is aware of this. I mean, right now, the cell phones that all of us carry are so innovative. Think about how great of a picture that you can take. 10 years ago, you couldn't do that nearly what's going on. GPS technologies, I can track where you are with your cell phones. Well, sort of the same thing here. Building and fencing technology. Technology allows staff to focus more on the human-oriented or the social aspects of the job and less on the security aspects of the job. Now, I'm not saying that the security aspects are not important. They absolutely are. You must maintain order in a jail or a prison. But it also allows, since we have all of this technology of watching what the inmates are doing, these corrections officers can now focus on really sort of talking, interacting with the inmates, and providing assistance. Because one of the things that we don't think about, we always think about corrections officers providing security, but that's not all they do. They tend to be social workers, they tend to be referral units, meaning that an inmate has an issue. Who are they going to go to? Well, they're going to go to the person that they see on a day-to-day basis. That person is probably going to be the corrections officer that's assigned to that area. So eventually, people are social creatures. We interact with one another. So this is the point of contact. So, the inmate goes up, "Yo, officer, I need this, I need that, I need access to the law library, I need to contact my lawyer," things of that nature. "I want to get my GED. How do I do this?" So the corrections officer now becomes this point of contact, this referral unit. All right, you know what? You give me 2 or 3 days, I'll have an answer for you and I'll see what I can do. Prisoner identification. Mugshots used to be taken with a regular camera or a Polaroid camera. Now they are digital cameras and they can be uploaded into a system. Fingerprinting on online data systems. And one of the things that we haven't really talked about is that it is possible that there is somebody in this world that has the same exact fingerprints that you do. The probability of that is about 1 in 40 billion, which means it's probable, but mathematically it's possible, but mathematically it's highly improbable. Even identical twins have the same DNA profiles, but they do not have the same fingerprints. They have similar fingerprints, but there are definite noticeable differences if you start really going into the fingerprint and looking point to point to point. Wristbands with barcodes, retinal imaging, so scanning the eye, things of that nature. With technology, we get advances in this as well. Well, that's going to be it for this chapter. I wish you guys the best. Have a great day. Take care.